千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. As always, I would like to extend a warm welcome to one and all. Thank you for joining us. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process in the Tao with one another. I think we are now ready to tackle chapter 80. We are very close to the end of the Tao Te Ching. Chapter 80 has a title in Chinese as well, like all the other Chinese titles. 3 characters with the last character, the one on the right, meaning chapter. In this case, the first character literally means small or little. The second character, the one in the middle, means country, nation, state, or it can just be a place. As I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion today, this chapter, chapter 80, and the next one, chapter 81, are the concluding chapters of the entire Tao Te Ching. The last part of the previous chapter, 79, about the Tao giving to those who are good and kind, is the last major point in the philosophy of Lao Tzu about virtue. You may recall that previously I talked about how the Tao Te Ching is actually divided into 2 parts, Tao Jing and De Jing, where Tao Jing goes from chapter 1 to 37, De Jing goes from 38 to 81. From this remark right here about this being concluding section of the entire Tao Te Ching, one can also make a pretty good argument that the Tao Jing remains the same. It goes from 1 to 37, but De Jing goes from 38 to 79. And then 80 to 81 form the conclusion. That will be very valid. Now, the importance of this juncture where we're at between 79 and 80 is that if you and I can understand what Lao Tzu is trying to express up to this point and put that understanding into actual practice in real life, then the power of practicing virtues is such that you and I can transform our lives, transcend the problems and issues of the material world, no longer be subject to the many distractions, temptations, rampant desires of the material world. All of this is a process of cleansing ourselves. It is also a process of a return to a state of simplicity. That state is the closest to our own original nature. With this chapter, chapter 80, Lao Tzu is depending on us to understand everything I have just expressed, and then Lao Tzu is asking the question, what will happen if there is a place full of individuals who are thus transformed because they understand? You would end up with an ideal place, a place of the Tao, or as Lao Tzu would call it, a small country. Let's take a look at the chapter itself. Small country, few people, let them have many weapons, but not use them. Let the people regard death seriously and not migrate far away. Although they have boats and chariots, they have no need to take them. Although they have armors and weapons, they have no need to display them. Let the people return to tying knots and using them. Savor their food, admire their clothes, content in their homes, happy in their customs. Neighboring countries see one another. Hear the sounds of roosters and dogs from one another. The people, until they grow old and die, do not go back and forth with one another. That is chapter 80 of the Tao Te Ching. So we're going to divide it into different sections now and talk about why the divisions look the way they do. Before we go there, let me just have a quick remark about the very last part, that the people, until they grow old and die, do not go back and forth with one another. This has sometimes been misinterpreted or misunderstood as meaning that the people who follow the Tao, they don't socialize. They don't visit back and forth with one another. They don't have these social visits. That's actually not what it means. What it has always meant from the beginning is that people who know the Tao have no attempts to interfere with one another. This going back and forth with one another is meant to depict a negative interaction where meddlesome people are constantly trying to get in somebody else's business. The people who know the Tao will not do that. The reason there's this misconception, even among people who know modern Chinese, is because there is a modern expression where the last line is about social visits, which is a positive interaction. So we'll talk about this again, but for now, let's do the sections. Similar to what we have seen previously, this chapter is divided into 4 sections as well, a rather common scheme among Tao Te Ching chapters. In this particular case, this is a longer chapter, more characters, more lines. So no longer the couplets arrangement that we saw before. It is still possible to see the matching couplets in the second and third sections, but we will get to that. So how do we divide this up into the 4 sections? Well, we look at the Chinese characters and then we take a look, we seek the repeating characters to detect sections that are similar. So right off the bat, you will see line 3 and line 5. The first character that repeats is a connective, which can be but it can also be and. And it's translated in 2 different ways, depending on the context. The second character in those 2 lines is always translated the same way. It's always a negative. So it's either no or not. No real expanded options beyond that meaning of the negative context. Now, if we look further down, we don't see these 2 characters repeated again. So that is an easy way for us to mark the first section. Looking at the second section, we see that, first of all, it's a repetition of 4 characters, 4 lines of 4 characters each. And there's a bunch of repeating elements, starting with the first 2 characters. And you can begin to see that this is the AB structure. So we're looking at the A part of the repetition, translated the same way, although they have. So those 2 characters are translated the same way. The second character there is always translated as has, have, possess, etc. And the first character is oftentimes used to say although. Now we have the B part in the AB structure, so let's take a look. In line 7 and line 9, you see 3 repeating characters. They're all translated the same way. They have no need for the first 2 characters and them for the last character. That last character can be singular or plural in English. It can be male or female. It is all dependent on context. Now, these characters don't repeat again in the lines below, and that's how we can identify it as one section. The next section down has repeating characters and poetic construction too. We can easily see it this way. In section 3, you've got the same character that is always translated the same way there. And then repeated 4 times in the same position within each group of characters. So the last section there has repeating characters, but they're in different positions. The first repetition there will be the same in the sense that it's the second from last character, translated as one another. And then it's repeated yet again in the last line. In the English translation, one another is the last 2 words for all 3 lines. Okay, so there we have the breakdown of the 4 sections of chapter 80. We are now ready to delve into the chapter line by line, in some cases character by character. Starting with line 1. Small country, few people. This is a very literal translation of the 4 characters. Each one of them, each character in the original matches the 4 English words one by one. So to Laozi, the ideal place is relatively small and uncrowded. The reason why is because it's not that many people, so you can really get to know everyone. The idea is not to know a lot of people in a shallow way, but just a few people in much more in-depth friendship. Less people also means less complexity and less friction. In such a place where you can get to know them, you can much more easily develop a sense of community. And one can much more easily live the simple life. What about in our lives today? I know many of us are living in big cities today. Not all of us, but a lot of us. It is still possible to live the simple life and to have deep friendships, develop good relationships with people. It is possible, it's just less likely. People who move from a small town to the big city oftentimes will tell you that they miss that aspect of small town living, where people are friendly, people are neighborly, they get to know their neighbors, there's less complexity in social interactions. Life is just simpler, smoother, better. when we have so many people in a big city, there's going to be more daily interactions and therefore more chances of people getting on your nerves. It's sort of like comparing the difference between being out in the middle of a very sparsely populated area where you can always get from one place to another quickly versus in the big city where it is oftentimes back-to-back traffic. Traffic is a horrible problem for everyone. It's hard to get from one place to another without contending through really bad traffic. So moving on, let's talk about line 2. Line 2 says, let them have many weapons. Right off the bat, when I translate it this way, I can see people raising an eyebrow. What? Lao Tzu is advocating for people to have many weapons? This can't possibly be right. Well, I want to set the record straight and explain why this translation is in fact very correct. And it can be clearly understood given the time when Lao Tzu lived historically. Now, the key to understanding of the second line is in the characters that I have highlighted, 3 characters. The first one is 十. So the one on the left is the ancient form. The one in parentheses is the modern form. It means 10 or 10 times. So 10 generically is what it means. Keep that in mind. The second character there, 百, means 100 or 100 times. So again, it's the ancient form of that, and there's a specific meaning that's tied to it. Now, those 2 characters, 10, 100, together can just mean many. Sort of like when we say, thanks a million, or I've told you 1,000 times, you know, not literally 1,000 times, but that I've told you many times. Thanks a million, not literally thinking a million times, but thanks a lot. Then the last character there, 气, by extension, 武器, where 武, the character there, means martial, things that are related to battles. 气 means tools, or in this context, tools of war. Tools of war are weapons. Now, I mentioned that there are going to be people who look at this line and feel that, well, it may just mean tools, it may not mean tools, implements of war, but just everyday tools in terms of labor-saving devices. That is a pretty popular interpretation as well. It is, so they will say that this, when interpreted as tools, just means that all the different instruments in life, labor-saving devices that people use, and the people who live in this place of the Tao, they have a lot of them. Now, it's unclear why the people who live in a place of the Tao will have numerous tools. But let's continue on, I will explain. The ancient manuscripts began commenting on the Tao Te Ching soon after it was originally surfaced in the world. So about 2,500 years ago, the Tao Te Ching was written. Soon after that, perhaps decades, perhaps centuries, but soon commentaries appeared to talk specifically about the meaning of the lines in the Tao Te Ching. By looking at the ancient commentary, we gain insights into what the Tao Te Ching actually said. And one of the things that's always been the case from as early as 2,000 years ago in the Han Dynasty is this. 十, the character meaning 10, referred to a small military unit, a team, or rather a squad, a group of 10 soldiers. In modern military, that would be called a squad, which is also around that number of people. In modern times, a team, 4 soldiers form a team, and twice that many form a squad. So what about the 100? Well, Bai is a larger military unit of 100 soldiers. So in other words, 10 of the squads, 10 squads equal a company of soldiers. In modern times, a company of soldiers will be 200 people. So it's the same magnitude, same level of military organization. Now, when you put these together, the instruments or the tools of a squad of 10 soldiers, as well as a company of 100 soldiers, then it is clear that those tools are the weapons used by these soldiers. So this is the classical interpretation found in ancient commentaries, not just from 2,000 years ago, but pretty much all the commentaries ever since. So that is the support that we have for understanding this context of weaponry, arms. And there's more. Let's continue on. My remark is that this talk that we have, this setting that we have, this would really be the only place where you can get this level of details and depth into the original writing of the Tao Te Ching. Line 2, let them have many weapons. Breaking down this entire line, we've got 6 characters there. The first character is let. There's no them, it's implied. The second character means to have. So it can be has, have, possess, etc. The third character, as we have talked about, will be 10, which can mean tens or many. And then the character after that, as we have talked about, it means 100. In this context, it can be hundreds or numerous. And looking back at the last slide, as you saw, if we consider those 2 characters to be groups of soldiers, then that makes sense too. The next character is the apostrophe S, and the last character is the character for tools. In this context, most likely weapons, because we can potentially translate this in a very literal way as let them have the weapons of squads and companies of soldiers. That would be a valid way of translating this line. This is another way to assess the accuracy of a translation. If you pick up a copy of a popularly available translation, flip to the end, look up chapter 80, and look at how they translate the second line. Do they say tools? Do they say weapons? Or something having to do with the military? If the latter, then the author knows the original context of the Tao Te Ching. If not, then likely it is authors without background in ancient Chinese, whether ancient Chinese language, literature, or history. They will lean toward tools because it is quite possible they assume Lao Tzu would never say people should keep a lot of weapons. They would assume the Tao is always peaceful and therefore must be against weapons. And that is going to be your clue that they do not fully understand the historical background of the Tao Te Ching. The transcription for this line can be this: let them have tens or hundreds of weapons. So if we don't want to talk about the groups of soldiers, this is one way to do it. This is an interpretation that reflects the historical warring stage period. That was the historical period when Lao Tzu lived. It was a time of great conflicts, many battles back and forth, non-stop strife and chaos. Now, the people at that time in ancient China, as later on throughout Chinese history, the vast majority of the people were farmers, because the ancient Chinese, they were by and large a peaceful agrarian society until the wars broke out. So the most people that were affected by warfare were farmers. When battles began, these were the people who were helpless, defenseless, who suffered as collateral damage as the armies marched back and forth, doing battle, not caring about the damage that they caused. So that's part of it. That's a historical background. That's the backdrop for Lao Tzu saying that in the ideal place with relatively few people, let them have many weapons. In that historical background, you can see Lao Tzu saying, let them have the ability to protect their homes and loved ones. Now it makes more sense. Now, there's more to say about that. I want to be very explicit in talking about what Lao Tzu potentially meant when he talked about having many weapons. During times of warfare, having weapons to the people, what would it mean? Well, number one can be more self-reliant. And the reason why I say that is because the peasants of ancient China at that time, or indeed any other historical period, often could not depend on their ruler to protect them. Even though they swear obedience to the emperor or the king and pay their taxes, they oftentimes could not depend on the ruler to be a competent ruler who would take action to defend or protect them. So they have to be more self-reliant. Now, to be self-reliant means the next bullet, you can protect your family. Specifically, protection of yourself and your family is an absolute necessity, whether you dig in to defend your home or you decide to run away from battle, you still need to be able to protect yourself and your family. So think about living as one such peasant or commoner or farmer back in those days. You have no choice but to be this way, to be self-protective, to be independent, to be self-sufficient. Lastly, this would also mean that invaders would think twice before invading if they knew in advance that they would overrun this area where many of the people have armed themselves. The smart thing for the warlord to do will be to go around and not risk any losses of their forces. Therefore, this is a deterrent for those would-be warlords. A non-military population that puts up resistance will be costly for the warlord. Even if he doesn't lose much of his force in the conflict, a possible defeat, indeed any losses at all, at the hands of peasants, lowly, weak peasants, would essentially bring such great dishonor that it would mean the end of his rule, and the end of his rule would also mean the end of his life. So the risk for the warlord would be proportionally many times higher than it is worth. Now, let's not forget, when we talk about the Tao Te Ching, we should always keep in mind how would this map to the world today. We don't live in a world of constant warfare like the ancient Chinese during that time of history. So does it apply? Well, metaphorically, we can think about the battles of life. When we map this to your world and mine today, it doesn't necessarily mean Lao Tzu is telling us to be well armed, that we should go out and buy a lot of weapons. The metaphorical language is that if we see the challenges of life as battles, then we want to be amply stocked with the appropriate weapons to fight those battles. Maybe a battle, quote unquote battle in the workplace. It may be a battle in the marketplace for your business. It may be a battle of wits with someone else. Whatever the case may be, life is oftentimes challenging and stressful, possibly contentious. We want to be ready to face all the different contingencies. That's the bottom line. So let's move on to line 3. Line 3 says, but not use them. Okay. For someone to look at the Tao Te Ching, reading these 2 lines with the accurate translation, that someone may say, what is the use of having many weapons if you're not going to use them? That doesn't make any sense. This must be an incorrect translation. Well, in reality, it is not only correct, but it is very accurate to the context of Tao philosophy. Let's break down the 3 characters. The first character is but. The second character, as I mentioned before, this is always the character for negation, a negative meaning, not. And then the last character there is use, but not use. Have many weapons, but not use. So there's no ambiguity to this line. There's no different ways of interpreting that. There's no, all the different interpretations are equally valid. That's absolute nonsense. This line can be translated exactly as it is, but not use. Overall, what Lao Tzu is advocating is a soft approach that is backed by strength. Or say it the other way, Lao Tzu is advocating that you possess strength that is ready for deployment, but it remains hidden and unused. Because the nature of the Tao and the nature of our higher selves is still peace. Now it makes sense. It is similar to when we say in the West, walk softly, but carry a big stick. Therefore, the Tao cultivator is always prepared, but prefers peace whenever possible. The Tao cultivator has a strong preference for peace, but this should not be mistaken as the same as being unarmed or unready or unprepared. That would be a big mistake. This is why we say the Tao is peaceful, but not pacifistic. And I want to compare and contrast the 2 different approaches to peace. So let me go to the next slide and demonstrate that. There's the pacifistic approach, and then there's the Tao approach. Sometimes they are conflated together because people assume the Tao is pacifistic. It is not. It is peaceful, which is a little bit different than pacifistic. Let me explain. And I have the picture of the globe here because I want to illustrate a difference between East and West, starting with West. And here, I'm going to quote a couple of lines from the Bible. Whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Together, these two lines is when we talk about turn the other cheek. This is from the Bible, but it is usually not something that people adhere to. And sometimes you will hear explanations about these two lines as meaning that this is the teaching from Jesus that basically says, let go of thoughts of revenge. On the surface, in the literal meaning of the words, is to say, offer yourself up for additional punishment, but the actual spiritual explanation from teachers everywhere is going to emphasize that this is about letting go of revenge. Now, I use these two lines for the pacifistic approach because if you take them literally, it is about that. It is about the conscientious objection to violence and guns in all its different manifestations, different forms. Sort of like what people describe as lying down like a rug, just being accepting of abuse, which I think we can see is not where the Tao is going. So whether your interpretation is literal or based on meaning, based on interpretation of those two lines, let's turn around and look at the Tao approach. So first of all, the Tao approach is certainly different from turning the other cheek, whether you understand that to be literal or metaphorical. In the Tao approach, we have a chapter devoted to taking care of a problem before it manifests, then taking care of a problem while it is still small. That applies in this approach to peace. That is, number one, be perceptive, be observant, be able to sense potential attack before it's even close. Give a wide berth if possible. There are so many avenues that we can take in life, so many options we can take. We don't need to put ourselves in a position to be harmed. We can steer far away. That's number one. Now, the sages recognize this is not always possible. You may already be within your proximity when the attack is about to occur. When that is the case, the approach from the Tao is to stop the attack before it starts. This may be reaching out to gain greater understanding, like, hey, listen, I don't want there to be misunderstanding between us. What I meant by so-and-so statement was, and use that understanding as a way to avoid conflict. Stop the attack before it starts. In martial arts, you're going to see moves where the observant and perceptive martial artist will prevent the enemy, the opponent, from winding up a devastating attack. Then, what if the attack has started and it is on its way, like a fist about to strike? Then the Tao approach, rather than to meet the strike with a strike of your own, fighting fire with fire, the Tao approach is to channel and redirect the energy of the attack, to deflect, to block, to redirect it, rechannel that energy so it doesn't harm anybody. And then stop further attacks with minimal force. That is, do the minimum necessary to stop the violence, to disable the opponent with as little pain and damage as possible. Disabling, not hurting, not injuring. Then there's also the aftermath, which has to do in the Tao approach with profuse apologies, sincere attempts to make amends. Try to turn enemies into allies. Try to create a friendship out of an initial negativity. So a different approach to peace. When you compare the two side by side, left to right, note that the Tao approach begins way before the smiting. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully, this is making sense for everybody. Hopefully, we have a greater understanding of the Tao approach to peace. Now, let's go to line 4. Let the people regard death seriously. Here's a line. Let's break it down. 4 characters. First one is let. The second one means people, citizens, subjects. And then the third character means heavy. Heavy or heavily. That's the only possible meaning in the third character in this context. And then the last character there is death. So heavy death, what is that? Well, to regard death heavily is the opposite of regarding death lightly. To regard death lightly is to not take it seriously. To regard death heavily is to have that serious regard. Of course, we don't say regard death heavily. That's not a valid expression in English. So we have to say seriously instead. And that's why line 4 is translated that way. This is really another way to express an attitude in the Tao that cherishes life, regarding death with serious intent means that you are cherishing life, the life that you have. Now, this is opposite to oftentimes what the ancient rulers felt about the people. The ancient rulers often disregarded the value of human lives. They didn't care if they killed 1 peasant or 10 or 100 or 1,000. It was nothing to them. And there has been so much warfare and strife throughout ancient Chinese history. During those chaotic times, human lives became nearly worthless. You could lose your life, nobody cared. Generally speaking, the worth of human beings, human lives, will rise with the flourishing of human civilization. So in this sense, Lao Tzu was ahead of his time in his high regard, in his cherishing of human lives, and in his description of this ideal place. Next line. And not migrate far away. So what does this mean? Lao Tzu is saying that when people cherish the life they have, they regard death seriously, that they would not migrate far away. This is because, and again in the context of historical times, when things were disastrous back in the Warring Stage period, people often had no choice but to flee for their lives. During that warring stage period, endless warfare was the cause of the fleeing. People became refugees. Of course, this is not so different today in the sense that in modern times, we still have conflict zones around the world. We're not a world that is entirely at peace with itself. There's still fighting, battles, wars all over the globe. And even without warfare, one can become a refugee due to other factors, like, for instance, natural disasters, flooding, earthquakes, etc. When natural disasters reach a certain magnitude, people become refugees and no longer can stay in a particular area. We've also seen economic disasters. We've seen government disasters causing crushing poverty, causing the economy to collapse in a particular country, causing mass starvation. There again, people have no choice but to flee for their lives. So that is the context of this line that we're talking about, not migrate far away. When Lao Tzu is thinking about an ideal place, this place we're discussing today, Lao Tzu is saying that, well, in such a place, peace prevails. People are safe and protected from violent conflicts. And further, Lao Tzu is envisioning that there are preventive measures against disasters. The weapons that we talked about would be a preventive measure against a disaster having to do with an attacking military that happens to be passing across your land. In this ideal land, Lao Tzu felt prosperity is widespread. No one goes hungry. There's no mass starvation here. So people would naturally cherish their lives lived in this place and regard leaving such a place as risky. They don't want to do it. They would prefer to be safe with the people that they know well, in a place they know well. So here we are in line 5, and we are coming to the end of our time today. We're going to need to continue our discussion next time. So far, what we have talked about in the first 5 lines, which form the first section of chapter 80, is about how in this ideal place, it's relatively small, relatively few people, but let them have a lot of weapons so they can protect themselves. Let them feel that there's no need to travel far away. In other words, leave their homes behind. They don't need to risk their lives. So there's plenty more to talk about. But for now, let's jump to the summary for what we have discussed so far. So what are some takeaways from this chapter? First, when we're talking about an ideal place, remember, we always want to apply this from ancient times to modern times, from the lives of the ancients to our lives today. This means, the suggestion is that we too can create an ideal place of our own. How can we do that? Well, the chapter offers some suggestions. Lao Tzu says, small country, few people. This means, number one, we want to limit the scale to just what you need. To be in the ideal place, you don't need to live in a big mansion. limit the scale to just what is needful for yourself and your loved ones. And then few people, it just means that you want to be selective of your friends. Your friends reflect the best in you. By being selective, you can improve yourself as you find yourself together with the people that you respect and admire. And you want to, with a few individuals that are worthy, you want to get to know them really well. So these are suggestions to be able to create an ideal place of your own based on the first part of this chapter. Secondly, we have seen Lao Tzu talk about let them have many weapons, and we map that to today's world as having the appropriate tools for the appropriate situations, including the battles, quote unquote, that you must fight in your life. So this implies, number one, that you always have backup plans. You always want to be prepared. You want to have your tools ready at a moment's notice. So it's like Batman with the utility belt that contains all the tools that he needs, with the Batcave with all the equipment that he needs to use. You want to also make sure you have all of your tools at the ready for deployment at a moment's notice. And this overall concept in the Tao is peace through strength. So this is not exactly the same as I remarked as being pacifistic. This is being peaceful and yet being prepared at the same time. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.